I used to live in the woods in Massachusetts, and at the end of my road, there once was a house. Now there's just a cellar hole that's filled with fieldstone. But there's a story I like to tell that I imagine could have happened at this house. A long, long time ago, there were weird old women who would gather together in the dark of the moon, and they would have supper together and then sit and make charms, cast spells. They'd make magic. They'd make mischief for everyone except themselves. Now, one October, in the dark of the moon, the leaves had changed colors and fallen to the ground, and those weird old women came from near and far, and they met in that house that used to be at the end of my road. They made a fine, rich stew, and then they made bread, and they sat and started to eat. Oh, it was good. The smell of the stew and the fresh-baked bread wafted out of an open window of that little house into the woods. And they were happy. They ate, they laughed. And then there was a knock at the door. Who could that be, they thought. And they counted themselves. They were all there. Who's there at the door, they called. And there was an answer. Someone who's cold and hungry too. Let me come in and eat with you. Oh, no, 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 they said. No, we cook for ourselves. We're not cooking for you. And they continued to eat. And they tore bread off of that nice warm loaf of bread, and they scooped up all of the gravy in their bowls, and they ate and ate and ate. And that knocking kept knocking. Well, after they finished eating, they pulled their chairs and made a circle and prepared to make charms and cast spells and make mischief for everyone except themselves. And the knocking kept knocking. One woman said, I can't concentrate with such noise. And another picked up the bread bowl and said, we'll have to give it something. She scraped the edges of the bread bowl until she had enough bread dough to make just a little tiny pea. She said, it's not much, but it will have to do. We'll cook this and give it to whoever's out there. She picked up the bread pan, put the little pea of bread dough in it, and then she placed that bread pan up on the shelf of the wood-burning cook stove. And then she sat down, and the knocking kept knocking. Well, to their surprise, that bread dough began to rise. It filled up the entire bread pan, just that little tiny pea of bread dough. And the knocking kept knocking. And that bread dough kept rising. It kept rising until it filled up the whole shelf of that cook stove, and then it dripped over onto the top of the cook stove, and the knocking kept knocking, and the women were puzzled. Go away! Who cooked for you? Huh? Not us. Who cooked for you? Who? But that bread dough just kept right on rising until it spilled off of the cook stove onto the floor, and it covered all of the floorboards. The women hooked their heels onto the slats of their chairs, and all the while the knocking kept knocking, and by this time the women were concerned. Oh, go away. Who cooked for you? Who? But that knocking kept knocking, and the bread dough kept rising, and it lifted the chairs right off of the floor. Well, the women put their feet on the chairs, seats, and then they sat on the backs of the chairs. The bread dough kept rising, and the chairs were lifting right off of the floor. The women hooked their heels onto the slats of the backs of the chairs, and the knocking kept knocking, and the women by this time were worried. Go away! Who'll cook for you? Who? But the bread dough just kept right on rising, and those chairs got so high their heads were almost touching the ceilings. They thought for sure that they might be swallowed up by that bread dough, and they were more than a little frightened. The knocking kept knocking. Who'll cook for you? Who? Who? They called out. They were scared, and they made their bodies smaller and smaller as their chairs got higher and higher, and they were being pressed up to the ceiling. The knocking kept knocking. Their eyes started getting larger and larger because they were filled with fright, and the knocking kept knocking. Who'll cook for you? Who? They called out. Who? And then the knocking stopped. And the women looked at themselves. Why, they realized that their arms had changed to wings, and their bodies had become the bodies of birds, brown and white feathers. They turned into owls. And then there was a voice saying, "Fly away, do! There's no more room in this house for you." And the bread dough fell. The women spread their wings and they flew out that window into the woods. And they're out there still. I know because I could hear them at night. They're still saying the last thing they ever said. Who'll cook for you? Who? Only now it sounds like this. Whoo, 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 whoo. Sounds a lot like the barred owl. It does. And that knocking? Never heard another thing about that. But that cellar hole, it's still there in the woods. Back near the end of the road where I used to live. Now, if you ever come to Massachusetts and I'm there, I'd be happy to show you that cellar hole. But don't ask me to take you there in October, in the full and the dark of the moon, because one night a year, those weird old women leave their owl shape and take their women shape, and they meet, look for a place where they can make charms and cast spells and make mischief for everyone except themselves.